EMP, electromagnetic pulse, and we go back to the Stone Ages overnight. Or catastrophic grid failure brought on by a terrorist attack. An actual pandemic that actually kills a giant chunk of the the world population, rather. These are all catchy, attention-getting collapse scenarios. Like a fast, catastrophic, end of the world as we know it collapse. But what if that's not what happens? I've been thinking about this recently. I don't see the future. I don't know what the future holds. I'm not a prophet. Don't pretend to be a prophet. None of these are prophecies. And I don't know when. Nobody knows the day or the hour. But I do like history. And if we look historically, slow collapses, generational collapses, are probably as likely as a catastrophic overnight complete collapse, complete financial meltdown in a day. EMP, everybody's computers and cell phones and cars just stop overnight. Now, those could absolutely happen, and generally that's what I prep for, because that's like a worst-case scenario. But what if it's not? What if it's a slow collapse? Like, yeah, sure, there was a day when the barbarians sacked Rome. Rome had been in decline for generations. Now, I would submit we have been in decline here in America at least since the 1950s. You could argue since 1916, but you really could make a case for since the 1950s. And I'm not one to pretend that the 1950s were perfect and everything was great. There was problems in the 1950s too, but all in all, when a man could go out and work a regular blue-collar job and support a family of, let's say, 4 on that income, have a decent house and have a decent car, and take care of his kids and not have a bunch of debt on a blue-collar working man's salary with one income. For most people, those days are gone. And we're not in a full-fledged collapse, but history may very well look back and be like, well, the decline started in, I would argue, the end of the 50s. You could really make an argument that it really went steeply downhill in 1964 for several reasons. But don't separate the two. I'm a Christian first and foremost. God is foremost in everything that I do. And if we look at the Bible and we look at biblical civilizations and even God's chosen people, when they follow God and do what God says and have strong biblical Judeo-Christian values and do the things that God says to do, their culture and society flourishes. And when they turn their back and spit in the face of God, civilization goes downhill. Well, if you take the economics side, because you can't separate them, I don't think it's hard to argue that America has been in a moral decline since, let's say, 1964. You could argue before that, but pretty obviously it's been in a decline. And I'm not even going to get off on a tangent on that. If you don't think that that's true, you just don't want to. So we see a decline morally and financially, quality of life, right? They go together. There's no separating those. So we are already in a collapse. Now, we could have another great awakening. We could have a great Christian revival, return to biblical values, just a slow decay in morals and way of life, which will affect, right? When you have a decline in morals in a nation, I submit it will affect everything. You'll have a decline in infrastructure. You'll have a decline in the economy. You'll have a decline in quality of life. You'll have an increase in crime, violent crime, theft of all kinds. You'll see a degradation of the justice system where you have several tiers, right? The Bible says, you shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. But we don't really see the same justice for all levels and strata in society anymore, do we? I submit that all goes together. And again, I would love to see another great awakening. I would love to see a great Christian revival and a return to the Bible taught in schools and the 10 Commandments in every classroom and the complete throwing out of Darwinism, which is its own religion, let's be real. I would love to see that. Maybe that will happen. But what if it doesn't and we just continue to degrade? And not overnight collapse, but a snowballing effect of decay. I've thought about that recently in my preps. I've been prepping for a while. It's not my first rodeo. And I think it's easy to overlook because I love prepper fiction, post-apocalyptic stuff. It's probably my favorite genre, that and history itself. Other than the Bible, post-apocalyptic stuff is probably my favorite. And of course, it's catchy to talk about catastrophic failures, right? It's I would say Hollywood, but Hollywood's so woke. It's a sensational novelist kind of. I was driving home from work and EMP went off and I knew exactly what it was and I had my bug out bag and women flocked to me like the salmon of Capistrano. Because I was a prepper and I had a bug out bag. And a Springfield XD that probably wouldn't work in real life, but it's a novel, so it's going to work flawlessly. And every time I open my bag, there's an endless supply of MREs. Right, that's catchy. It's like, yeah. Validates all my spending and purchases. I'm the wise one. I get it, right? Like, that makes the better novel. But again, historically, what might be more, or I don't know about more, again, I don't see the future, but what might be as likely is a slow collapse. It's not cool to talk about, I had to work twice as hard, I had to work 80 hours to feed my family, but I still had to go to work and pay the mortgage because the bank still required the mortgage. The cost of everything is going up and my labor is not getting compensated at a just rate. Or a slow collapse like, yeah, the police don't really function as they should, the fire department doesn't really function as they should, wait times have doubled, tripled, quadrupled. Maybe there are still medications and stuff, but it's intermittent. You can't just expect to go to the doctor and get immediate emergency care. Maybe you get put on a list. Maybe you can't get all the antibiotics. You get the idea, but you still basically, you have to work. Still some kind of economy. You still have to pay your mortgage or your rent. You still have to drive. You still have to go into the city. A slow decline and degradation. Not as fun, right? But I think I would do you a disservice since I am trying to consider these things. How would we, if this was going to be the future, how would we prepare for this other than ways we would prepare for a catastrophic, lights out tomorrow? Well, what if the lights go out tomorrow, but they come back on and they go out again, rolling brownouts? I'm not just talking about in California. I'm talking about like all across the nation. What if the government and big corporations start milking the power grid because it takes an enormous amount of energy for AI, artificial intelligence, and that's making them more money than you are. They're taking your energy and giving it to AI, the development of AI. You only get power twice a week or whatever. Where you still can basically have things you can't rely on just turning the lights on all the time. But you're not exactly in the Stone Ages, right? Not Amish with an M16. What are some things you could do there? You could, without spending a ton of money, because I know this prices out a lot of people, without going like full solar on your house or making your own wind turbine, which those are all good things if you can afford them. Maybe simple things like small, portable solar chargers where, these things don't work great, but maybe you have a small solar charger where you can put it out when the sun first comes up and then by noon you have a decent charge on your cell phone. Or you have something that takes a very minimal amount of electricity, as in a radio. Remember those, like old school radio, AM radio? I say AM because I live high up and deep in the mountains, but AM, FM radio, single sideband, low energy, right? It takes very, very little energy. They even have hand crank radios, solar powered radios, where a small solar panel is enough. Kind of like it, the old calculators, the old Texas Instruments you might have had if you were my age, where you had the little teeny solar panel, but it doesn't take much electricity, so it'll power it. Something like a simple radio for some entertainment, for some news. If there's some kind of dystopian thing where I rules all the social media apps and you don't know what you can trust, what you can't trust, but small local radio networks are actually still around. A partial collapse. How about a balkanization? Like the splitting up. The term civil war has been thrown around so much in the media and stuff as far as prepping and survival goes. I kind of don't want to use it. Let's say balkanization, where the country splits apart into several different factions that more or less cooperate. Maybe there's some border skirmishes. Maybe this person didn't pay their tolls and they, that regional power has a dispute. But for the most part, there's trade between east of the Mississippi, the Iron Curtain, the new 1984, and, the Free American West and the Pacific Northwest Alliance. There's tenuous but steady trade. You can still get goods. You can still go to the store. Maybe you can't go and get fresh produce all year of everything that you want. Maybe you can only get strawberries once or twice in a year, a few months out of the year, like is normal before shipping stuff all around the world. You get the idea. Probably go in and get potatoes, onions. Maybe they're expensive, but they're still a basic economy. Now that radio would come in handy for that. You could communicate and figure out what's going on outside of your area. Another thing that we can talk about, if the grid is intermittent for whatever reason, the internet is intermittent for any reason, you may have forgotten a thing called books. I love books. I like to read books. Of course, I believe the core book that you should have is a compilation of books, the Bible, your manual for life. It will be just as important then as it is today. It is always true. It is always your source of truth and the best guide for how to live your life. That won't change. Whatever happens. Whatever happens. That's something I can tell you, whatever the future holds. What should you do? What the Bible says. But other books too, other books that could come in handy. I mean, paperback books. And hey, I love Audible. I love audiobooks as much as the next person. I really do. They're fantastic. If I turn around now from where I'm recording, I have a bookshelf. I'm just going to mention a few here, not all of them. Grid Down Prepper Projects, The Hunter's Guide, Wilderness Survival, Foraging for the state that I live in, Strategic Relocation, Guerrilla Gunfighter Volume 2, To Ride, Shoot Straight, and Speak the Truth. Just a few, right? There are many, many good books out there. Whatever you're into. There's nothing wrong with having just a few fiction books. I like the classics. Probably good to have some of those on hand. Anyway, actual bound books. Also, silver and gold. Now, I generally wouldn't say start with prepping silver and gold because you can't eat gold. You can't eat silver. There is a catastrophic collapse. Can't even bother toting around silver as much as that's cool in the prepper novels. It's going to take a while if massive amounts of people are starving to death for people to give two craps about silver. You're better off with whatever beans and rice you can buy now with that amount of silver. Once you have a decent store of food now, if you think a slow collapse is possible, where if you look at things that have happened in our lifetime, like Argentina, look at the Iran currency right now. A lot of people are talking about the color revolution in Iran and the Gen Z revolutions going on in Iran and other places in the world. And that's cool and that gets headlines. But look at what's happened to Iran's currency. The big reason people are up in an uproar is that their currency has lost value rapidly. Well, what if, the BRICS nations, and again, I don't see the future, but Brazil, Russia, India, China, I don't even know if that alliance is as strong as it was a year ago, but something like that happens. One of the reasons, if you're not familiar with, basic U.S. economic history, Federal Reserve, which is not federal, but, 1916, and then we get off the gold standard, then we get off the silver standard, and then we go to the petrodollar, I forget, sometime in the 70s. And a lot of that being the petrodollar, where Saudi Arabia, and by extension OPEC, has been trading a major commodity like oil in U.S. dollars, has been propping up the dollar. Well, if they decide we're not going to do that anymore, that could really, really have a dynamic shift in the U.S. dollar. We still use the U.S. dollar. Maybe it's like the Weimar Republic, where the inflation is like exponential daily. Today gas is $100, but tomorrow it's $200 a gallon. Right, that could happen. If you look at around the world, just don't think because, it could happen in Argentina and it can happen in Iran, but it can't happen here. That's normalcy bias. I think in a total collapse, silver or gold would take a long time before they're worth anything. But in a partial collapse, silver and gold would be worth a lot more than the dollar. That's kind of one of the things, right? Tethered to them being at a historic value. Currencies come and go. But silver and gold since we've had nation states has had value. So again, if you have food stored, you have ammo stored, you have the basic prepper, like if things, the balloon hits the fan tomorrow, to mash together two different sayings. If the balloon hits the fan tomorrow, yeah, you're going to want ammo. You're going to want beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. I'm not saying we started to open the seals of Revelation. I'm not saying that. But one of the things it says in Revelation, right, one of the four horsemen, a quart of wheat for a denarius. A denarius is a day's wage. What if you work your butt off all day and you have just enough to eat that day? That's a big chunk of the world. Generally, we live in an opulent time right now. Maybe take some of that opulence and put it in silver. But if you're working all day to feed yourself, your family, then something comes up where you need more, you dip into that silver. Even if there's not a complete currency collapse, it could get to the point where it's worth far, far less. It's not worth less, but it's worth far, far less, if that makes sense. Now, I grew up poor, and I don't just mean that saying that like I only grew up with one video game system. Like, no, I mean I grew up poor. Like, we would sleep on the floor around a kerosene heater in the winter because the house wasn't heated. We didn't have a phone, so we'd have to walk to the middle of downtown back when they still had payphones if we wanted to call a member of the family. Poor. Now, I'm not crying about it. I didn't go hungry, but I grew up poor. A lot of people today did not grow up poor. They grew up decent, middle class, and by the world standards, very rich. But maybe learning some of those po folk skills, those poor redneck skills. Maybe right now it's just cheaper and easier to take your truck in for an oil change. I get it. There come a time where, again, that devalue of the currency, it's all you can do to get gas in the car and get 5 quarts of oil, 6 quarts of oil, whatever it takes for your truck. Maybe you're doing things you wouldn't normally do, like having to clean out an old oil filter or clean out an old air filter and reuse them. Change your own oil. Those kind of redneck skills, right? The ability to patch a tire. Because you have to make it to work to pay your mortgage and you can't afford a new tire. Again, not as cool, not as awesome as a total, catastrophic, everything's medieval tomorrow, guys are running around with crossbows and leather pants or whatever. I don't know. Not as cool as that, right? But again, historically, this is probably as historically relevant to be prepared for. Things like learning how to sew. And you might say it's not manly or whatever, but I can sew. It probably still is, but when I was in the military, you were expected to know how to sew. Yeah, if you're in country and you tear your uniform on barbed wire, concertina wire, whatever, and it's got a cut in it, you're expected to sew that up. There's no seamstress. You get promoted, you might have to sew your rank on. Now, I guess they don't do that as much anymore. Most of the new uniforms are Velcro, but you get the idea. Knowing how to sew. Maybe now it's cheaper just to throw your old jeans away and go get a new pair of jeans at Walmart. But if a quart of wheat is a day's wages, what if a pair of jeans is 3 weeks worth of wages? You don't think that's possible? Go look at what blue jeans were worth in the Soviet Union in the 90s. Knowing how to repair jeans, knowing how to sew on a patch. All these morale patches are cool and trendy now. The original use of a patch was actually to patch up clothing that was torn and nasty so you could still use it and be serviceable. Like when you didn't want these torn up jeans to look stylish, but you actually needed jeans to function, and you wore out the knees in your jeans because you worked hard, put patches on them. That's where the patches come from. Now they started getting cool, like smiley faces or don't tread on me or whatever morale patches, but the original use of a patch was to patch a hole in clothing. Knowing how to sew on a patch, again, not as cool as buying another 1,000 rounds of 5.56. I get it, but probably a skill worth having. Again, a total collapse where everybody's running around in multicam and fighting off Cuban paratroopers. Sounds super cool. What if you still got to go into work at a blue-collar job and slug it out day to day? If a bunch of these techie jobs sit in a cubicle go away and you still got to feed your family, so you got to, grab a shovel or a pickaxe or work on a road crew or whatever to feed your family. I hope you would do that to feed your family. But in a partial collapse like this, being able to make stuff may actually be relevant again. Knowing how to fix stuff may actually be relevant again. Maybe there is some electricity, but maybe it's, again, rolling brownouts and it's the wintertime and your two options are freeze or go cut and split wood. Well, Somebody that does that and has a wood stove and regularly uses wood heat, not a big deal. But many people have grown up never splitting wood. You don't know how to split wood. You don't know how to cut a tree down without getting hurt. You don't know how to limb. You don't know how to split. You don't know how to buck. Those are probably skills worth having. Even maybe you live in like the mid-Atlantic where you're not going to freeze to death in the winter, but it's going to be pretty miserable. Somebody, again, that grew up without regular heat, it's pretty miserable to be cold all winter. Knowing those skills like how to split wood. This is something I learned from my family. How to talking about changing your own motor oil. How to get that old motor oil and use it as heating oil. How to recycle it instead of just throwing out your old motor oil. Like, I don't generally do that nowadays. I certainly know how. I certainly could make a drip hopper that goes into my wood stove that greatly increases my heat output. Burning wood and supplementing it with used motor oil. Right? Skills like that could make a big difference. What about antibiotics? Now, there are ways to get antibiotics in the same dosages and the same things that you would normally get. Now, you're obviously going to need knowledge for this and what antibiotics are for what and what use, going back to books we mentioned earlier. But antibiotics, again, now you can just go and get antibiotics. No big deal. But what if you can't? Or what if, again, you're working all day just to buy enough basic gruel to stay alive? One of your family members need antibiotics and you just can't. You just can't afford it. You can get antibiotics now. Now, they don't store forever, but they store for a while. And I submit to you, much as people look at silver or gold or ammo, if you had a massive infection, of which I've had, that could kill you, and you're dying, you would trade every gun that you have, every round of ammunition that you had, for a course of antibiotics that today comparatively cost you very little. So I would say don't overlook that. I think it is possible for somebody to make their own antibiotics, but you're probably not doing it when you need it, and that's pretty intense. You probably just want to have some on hand. If you get so far in that years and years in, those antibiotics aren't good anymore, then maybe you start transitioning to making your own or whatever, but just having some on hand, again, if things don't completely collapse, but you can't just go to the doctor and get antibiotics because they come, I don't know where they come from. Let's say they come from China, and we're not trading with China, and we don't have any capacity to make our own for 2 years. That's when your daughter gets a massive infection in her leg, gangrene, or, who knows what. People in days of yore, fairly affluent people, I remember hearing about one that died because he got a mosquito bite or cut himself shaving or something, and it not a big deal, but it got infected. Look at how many people, in the Civil War died of infection. So, again, antibiotics. For what they cost now, for what they bring to the table, you staying alive, that is a big deal. So, a little side note, as somebody that's been a professional gunfighter most of his adult life, that's had a deal in this world, one of the first things that's done when you get shot after you stop the massive bleeding? A big dose of antibiotics. Just throwing that out there. So antibiotics, don't overlook those. And I don't generally do this because, one, I don't think it's healthy. But two, it's a waste of money nowadays. But a lot of people nowadays, guys in my current economic status, they order DoorDash all the time. They order Uber Eats a lot. They'll have somebody deliver them a coffee. I assume many of them go out to eat after work. That adds up. I could afford to do that, but why? It just seems like a waste of money to me and a good way to wreck my health. For a lot of people that are doing that, if you're doing that, you might want to figure out now how to cook. Because there may come a time where you can't afford to do that. You barely have enough to eat this week. If you are eating rice and beans, ramen noodles, and tuna fish. I remember growing up rice and tomato sauce. That's what you had. If that's what you can afford to eat because the economy's collapsed, but you still got to go to work, you had better know how to buy cheap food and make cheap food nutritious and supplement it. Things like mixtamalization of corn so you don't get really nasty ailments from eating corn that's not been, treated with wood ash. Right, skills like that. Talking about the rolling brownouts. Maybe you do hunt. Maybe you still can get a deer or an elk, but you can't rely on the freezer to preserve it. A lot of people nowadays, they'll go hunt for the rack or whatever, and they get the venison, but they take it to a processor. The processor butchers it. They don't know how to butcher. The processor turns it into jerky, turns it into sausage. The processor preserves it, turns it into jerky. They get it, they quarter it, they cut it up and put it in a freezer. Well, none of those things are probably likely in this kind of scenario. If you get a deer, you had better know how to preserve it, and you had better know how to preserve it when it's not cold out. It's fairly easy to preserve meat in Montana in January. Not easy to preserve a deer in Georgia in September, unless you know the right techniques. That humidity, that heat, it's just a breeding ground for bacteria. You had better know those. And I do this stuff anyway because I like it, and I actually enjoy the butchering and preserving of meat. I like biltong. I routinely eat it. I just wanted to see how it would work, talking about understanding these techniques. Made venison chili, and I used some fresh elk, and then I used some venison from a year before that had not been refrigerated, that I had dry aged. I ate some of it just like that, and I put some in the chili to see what it would taste like. And you know what? It was fantastic. It was so good. And that was a year or more old, dry aged. Right? But if you don't do it correctly, it could go bad in a day or two. You got to know what you're doing. You got to have things to do it with. You got to know technique. Like smoking meat. Dry aging and smoking meat. That's a thing. Here's the cool thing about this stuff. Even if economy improves and gets better, right? This is just a great skill to have. Being able to make your own jerky and your own sausage and your own biltong and dry age and smoke meat. It's fantastic. Why wouldn't you want to do that anyway? A lot of times now, beef is expensive, especially if you buy like a cut ribeye. But if you're creative and you go in with a neighbor and you buy half a beef, right, half a cow, and you butcher it yourself, you can eat as good, save up a little bit of money, maybe do it once a year, half a beef for your family. That's a lot of meat. Know how to preserve it, age it. You can do it the way that you want to, right? I like really spicy food. My wife loves really spicy food. Things like ghost pepper jerky. I don't mean like the stuff you get at the gas station that's a little bit spicy. I mean stuff that would make most grown men cry. I love that stuff. Ghost pepper, insanity, habanero. And that's just my example. You may really like teriyaki. You may really like some weird flavor that I don't like. But who cares? You can make it yourself. Last year, I think we turned an entire elk, not the backstrap, but most of an elk into jerky. This was last year, and I did the calculation of inflation. If I had just bought that in bags of jerky in pounds, it would have been like thousands of dollars. I can get hundreds and hundreds of pounds of meat, and I can get really good jerky and biltong and dry aged loin. Right? These are skills, again, that will be good no matter what happens, but especially if there's like a slow partial collapse. Maybe you take your deer to a processor now. Maybe you won't be able to afford that. And maybe you make a grievous mistake. You live in Georgia and you thought it would be a good idea to spray the carcass down with a hose to get the blood off. It stays wet overnight and you come out and a bunch of flies have laid eggs in it. That's gross, right? Yeah, that sucks. But it's better to learn that now when you can just go to the store and buy more food than when that's the deer you're trying to feed your family and it's eat maggot meat or die, right? Not as cool, not as hip as prepper fantasy stuff, but this is real stuff. Like I grew up hunting, and if I'm being honest with you, I grew up poaching. Why? Because I was poor. And I would go out and hunt to put food on the table. And yeah, maybe I wouldn't have starved to death, but man, a good piece of venison on a fire is a lot better than a bowl of rice with some tomato sauce. Sorry, vegans, it just is. But again, knowing some of these basic skills, being able to take something like a deer off the hoof and turning it into jerky and biltong and backstrap and stew and curry. You still go to the store and buy some ingredients, but you stretch it a lot farther. You get some onions. Instead of buying spinach, you pick some dandelions, which are just as good as spinach. They're phenomenal. If you live in a city, probably don't pick those because they're probably sprayed with Roundup and peed on by a dog or whatever. But out in the country, there's a bunch of good leafy greens. Lamb's quarter, Wazantle, dandelion. If you want to get into foraging, which is something I really enjoy, and I really enjoy doing it with my wife, it's a good hobby anyway. It's good healthy food anyway. Probably good to know what you can eat in your area now. Something my wife and I really like to do together. I like to hunt. She likes to hunt, but I think if I'm being honest, she likes picking berries. I think my wife likes just as much us going to pick berries in the summer because she likes berries. She likes to make jam, which is another thing you could do. And like standing in the sun on a beautiful day and picking berries. Now, I'll be honest, I'd rather run around and try and kill something, put meat on the table. But I really enjoy spending that time with my wife. We can talk and be out in the sun and playing with the dogs and foraging. Something we really like. It sure beats watching TV. And on food and like cooking and preparing stuff. Maybe now, and it's not, if you got the money and disposable income, hey, do what you want, support local business. Maybe you go, community is important, right? Maybe now you go and you go to a fancy restaurant with a bunch of your friends and you drop, several $100s on a nice dinner. But maybe in the future with inflation, that's several $1,000s and you just can't do that. Well, going back to, you got that deer. You get some basic ingredients, onions, you pick some dandelions. Maybe all the group's kids get together and you all pick dandelions. Wash them and treat them. Put some basic ingredients, like maybe you still go to the store for some stuff like curry powder and onions. Well, scratch that, wild onions are pretty ubiquitous across the United States. You got wild onions, you go and pick those. Got dandelions, you got basic things like peanut butter, curry powder, salt, and you make a fantastic Mediterranean peanut butter venison curry. Like dandelion and raspberry salad. Does that sound so bad? Actually, I'd rather have that than the fancy restaurant. I'm not a fancy restaurant kind of guy. I'll go when one of my buddies really wants to go for their birthday or something, but I would just assume cook for a bunch of people. Go to somebody's home cooking. And maybe it's because I grew up poor in the South, but that was just a common thing. Somebody's granny have folks over for a big meal, and it didn't have to cost a bunch of money. Have to have anything fancy. Fried chicken and mashed potatoes. It was just as good as any high-end restaurant. Maybe we get back to that in a slow collapse. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad in a lot of ways. But getting those skills now before it's crucial. Just some thoughts, and there are probably a dozen other that I didn't list. But some thoughts about what if it's a slow collapse of civilization, a noticeable devaluation of the currency. I think it would be irresponsible to only prepare for the overnight catastrophic and not give some thought to, what if we're already in a slow decline of an empire? You should still be able to live a good, fulfilling, Christ-centered life. And a good wrap-up for this would be what Paul says. The words of Paul from the 4th chapter of Philippians, New King James. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.